Hello, and welcome to Criminal Mischief, the art and science of crime fiction. I'm D.P. Lyle. Today's show is entitled Fentanyl, a Most Dangerous Game. You've read about fentanyl, it's been all over the news. It's a very dangerous newcomer on the drug scene. Now, drugs and their entire world have played into crime fiction for many, many years, all the way back to the old Mickey Finn back in the noir days. And a Mickey Finn was basically chloral hydrate dumped into an alcohol beverage of some type and given to someone to sedate them or knock them out. It was also called a Mickey. And chloral hydrate's still around. It's sold as a children's sedative under the name Noctec. It still works. You can still put chloral hydrate into food or a drink and take someone down. Um, and many crime writers have used that. But drugs and the drug world fit into crime fiction very well because there's so many interesting criminal elements that are involved in that world. It may be the local drug dealer who has involved in something else, a murder or whatever, and your sleuth has to find this person and take them out of business one way or the other. It may be that this individual has witnessed another crime and is going to be a witness for a murder. Drug dealers live in dark worlds. It may be that a drug is used to sedate someone and overpower them and take them somewhere. It may be that drugs are used for murder, which is very common. Uh, Chemicals and drugs of all types have been used for murder, from the old days of arsenic to the more modern day of numerous drugs available for that. Um, it may be that you're writing a story about biker gangs and their meth dealings, or a Mexican drug cartel smuggling drugs and weapons and people across the border. Uh, so drugs are ubiquitous in crime fiction. Um, the the drug addicted and alcoholic cop is almost a cliche now, but it still works. Um, and that goes the same for PIs and for amateur sleuths. Everybody's damaged, everybody has problems, and often drugs and alcohol are involved in that. In my career in medicine over the last 50 years, I've seen a lot of problems with drugs, from marijuana to you name it. Cocaine was big for a long time, and we saw a lot of heart attacks and a lot of cardiac arrhythmias that were stimulated by this drug, which can do both. Methamphetamine. Back when I was in college, it was Dexedrine that a lot of people took to stay up late. I never understood that. I figure if you don't know it by midnight, you're not going to learn it between then and morning. And the most important thing for taking a test was to be fresh, so you could think clearly. Um, but Dexedrine was around. That's basically a form of speed. And of course, diet pills were big for a long, long time. They came under many trade names and were around, and people abused them. And but methamphetamine came along, and it's a whole different animal. It's a deadly, nasty drug. It's highly addictive. Crack cocaine, when you smoke it, becomes even more addictive than the cocaine that people snort. Or it's a terrible, terrible disease, as it were. Um, there was PHP. There was phencyclidine, angel dust, which was one of the most dangerous drugs that I ever saw. But fentanyl has entered the market, and it is extremely deadly. It's a synthetic opioid, which means it's in the opioid family, meaning from opiums. And this is everything from the codeine in your cough syrup to heroin. Those are all opium-based um, drugs, with the heroin coming from morphine. Um, but this is a synthetic drug, so it's manufactured. It is 300 times more powerful than morphine. It can kill when it's injected, when it's ingested, when it's inhaled, and it can even penetrate the skin. And there are preparations used for pain management that are patches, and that'll become important in a story I'll tell you later. Um, so it's a deadly, deadly drug that can enter the body by almost any method, and it takes such a tiny amount. Now, in medical situations, it's frequently used for pain management. And since it is so highly addictive, like oxycodone and things like that, it's often used in terminal patients with cancers that have bone metastases and are in extreme pain, or pancreatic cancer, or any other terminal disease where the pain is severe. Fentanyl is wonderful that. It's used when you got your colonoscopy or you had some other outpatient procedure. They use a little fentanyl and a little Versed uh, to kind of knock you out so that you don't remember any of the procedure, and it's more pleasant than it would be otherwise. It's used as a sedative, or twilight anesthesia, we call it, for in those situations. But it's also the number one cause of drug overdoses. And a really disturbing statistic is that the Americans have a 1% chance of dying of an opioid overdose. Think about that. That's 1 in 100. That's a lot of people. It means it's people you know. 60 people die every day of opioid overdoses, with fentanyl being a huge player in that. So that translates to over 22,000 people a year. There was some data that showed that the U.S. life expectancy actually dipped between 2016 and 2017, predominantly due to opioid overdoses. Now, a case in point is that recently in Chico, California, some people at a party apparently had used some drugs that had been laced with fentanyl. I don't think that that's actually been stated yet, because I'm not sure that the medical examiner office and the police have completed their investigation, but boy, it sure smells like it. Somebody went down on the front porch of the party, quit breathing, collapsed, and they started doing CPR. Of course, called the medics and the cops, and everybody showed up. They found more people in the garage, other people scattered around the house, out in the yard, whatever. 13 people had overdosed at one time, at one party, on one batch of drugs. That's what fentanyl can do. It is so powerful. Okay, so how did it get there? I mean, were these people going around snorting fentanyl or shooting it up, or inhaling it, or smearing it all over their skin? What were they doing? Well, drug dealers often add fentanyl to heroin in order to boost its effect, because heroin is powerful, but fentanyl is more powerful. Now, heroin, when you inject it into your body, almost immediately is converted by enzymes in the blood to a type of morphine. So you're basically injecting morphine. And I've already said that fentanyl is many times more powerful than morphine. Well, if you add the two together, you're taking two sedatives. You're taking heroin / morphine, and you're taking fentanyl together. Duh. They're going to potentiate each other. They're going to magnify each other's effects. Well, people die from heroin overdoses all the time. Well, you add a little fentanyl to it and you boost that through the roof. And that is where the problems come. It's also added to meth. It's also added to cocaine. It's also added to a lot of other drugs. It's packaged into pills and sold as OxyContin when it's really not OxyContin, another deadly drug, but not on the order of fentanyl. It is so incredibly, incredibly dangerous. How does it kill? Well, like all opioids and sedatives and anesthetics and all those things, but opioids, what it does is it works in the brain and it suppresses what we call the respiratory center. And that lives in the very upper part of the spinal cord, what we call the brainstem, right below the base of the skull. It's where the spinal cord comes through the foramen magnum, the main hole in the back of the skull, going downward, and then goes down to the body and supplies the whole body with innervation. That very first little part of it is where the respiratory center lives. And when you shut that down, the victim quits breathing and they die from asphyxia. Now, the antidote for this is a drug called Narcan, or naloxone. And I've got a link for that, as I always do, in my show notes and stuff that you'll find on my website and on my blog. So you can learn more about all this stuff. There's links to all the stories we're going to talk about here and all the things we're going to say here. to kind of expand your knowledge there a little bit. But Narcan works immediately. I mean, within a minute, and it reverses the effects of any opiate, and the person wakes up almost immediately. Police carry it around now because the opioid overdose problem is huge, and they can just inject it. There's even a nasal spray they can use, but most of them use the injections. You just stab it in the guy's leg, you push the button, done. And in a minute he wakes up and says, "What happened? What happened?" Well, it happens all the time. So how powerful is fentanyl? I mean, I talked about it being so much stronger than morphine, but let's put this in perspective. A tablespoon, a single tablespoon of fentanyl could kill 500 people. That means only a little pinch, or as we say in the South, a little dab will do you. 120 pounds of it, a couple of big suitcases, could kill 25 million people. In a recent bust, the largest in U.S. history, they recovered 250 pounds of fentanyl that had been hidden in a truck crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. That's enough to kill 50 million people. 1/6 of the population. That's amazing. It is amazing. It is such a dangerous drug. It's so dangerous that when police confront someone, have an encounter with someone who they think possesses fentanyl, and they're going to search their vehicle or search their person or search bags or search whatever they need to search to look for it, they will take precautions. They will wear gloves. Sometimes they'll wear a filtration mask so that when they handle anything, if fentanyl and fentanyl powder is in there, it won't touch their skin. They won't inhale it because they can go down too. And they can go down quickly and hard, and they can die. So they're very careful when they do this. And again, it's why they carry Narcan. It's so dangerous that those wonderful people who run the dark web, whatever that is, it's the web that you and I can't get on, but it's where a lot of bad things happen, where you can buy people, you can buy drugs, you can buy weapons, you can hire a hitman, you can do all kinds of stuff in the dark web. It's like an open market for anything nefarious. A lot of the people in the dark web who sell drugs, and you can get literally just about anything, have stopped selling fentanyl, mainly because it's probably brought too much heat and too much of a spotlight on them. But hopefully it's just because they got a moral conscience, though I doubt that's it. But the point is that this drug has gotten such a nasty reputation, yet it's still out there and it's still used all the time. Well, something else for you international thriller writers and political thriller writers and spy versus spy writers and all of that stuff. Could fentanyl be used as a weapon of mass destruction? A WMD? Could it be used to kill a whole bunch of people? Of course it could. You make an aerosol out of it. I remember many years ago, my late and dear friend Barbara Saranella, who I still miss, was writing a story. And I think it was her final book before she passed. And she wanted to take out a train engineer and wanted it to happen very, very quickly so that he couldn't stop the train and it would be a runaway train and stuff like that. Good thriller material. And so he had a speed lever that they push back and forth. And what we came up with for that is to take a small CO2 cartridge and load it with a fentanyl aerosol. Basically, you take a liquid and you put it under pressure, and when it escapes, it'll make an aerosol. And it's just like a CO2 cartridge that you use for air guns and bottle openers wine openers and things like that. You used to use them for that. And so CO2 cartridge, and you just build one, except inside there's a few an ounce of liquid fentanyl, which is easily made. And in fact, the injectable form is liquid, or you can take a powder and dissolve it in something. And you put it under pressure. So you put it in a position that's kind of out of sight. But when the guy pushes the throttle forward, a little knob had a little knob on there, so it punctured the end of it. And the gas was released, and he would go down almost instantly. How quickly? Could be a matter of seconds. Could be one breath, two breaths, gone. Staggered, confused, disoriented, down, and possibly dead from asphyxia. Would this really work? Well, actually it would. Because in 2002, a group of around 50 Chechen terrorists took over a Moscow theater. There were 850 people taken hostage. It went on for like about 4 days, the hostage negotiations. Many of the attackers were strapped with explosive vests. And the negotiations weren't going well. You know, the rebels had their demands, and the KGB and the Russian military were not going to back down, and they had all these hostages in there, and it was a very ticklish situation, and they weren't really sure what to do. But at the end of the day, the Russians pumped something into the ventilation system. Now, it was most likely fentanyl, but if not, it was carfentanil or remifentanil. In other words, analogs of fentanyl, but basically it was fentanyl. They pumped it into the vents and took everyone down. It worked fairly quickly. None of the terrorists set off their vest. All the terrorists were killed. Unfortunately, a couple hundred of the hostages also died because the medical personnel couldn't get in there and inject them with Narcan or naloxone fast enough. And a lot of them died. That's how powerful it is, and that's how quickly it works. So you ended up with 50 terrorists, 150 people, 900 of them, and 150 of them thereabouts end up dead because you can't get in there fast enough to help them. Interesting. But that's how it works. So think about that in your story. What if? You know, we've talked about sarin and VX gas, and thriller writers have talked about that for years, and this works just as quickly as a neurotoxin. But now you've got a drug that is easily available. Sarin and VX are hard to get, but fentanyl is not. It's everywhere. You can buy it on the street all the time. So your bad guys could very easily create an aerosol situation, or a foodborne situation, or a drinkborne situation, or a touch situation. You could put it in lipstick. You could put it in eye drops. You could take somebody down, or you could take a group of people down very quickly. This is good stuff for storytelling. Really good stuff for storytelling. Because things always evolve, and if fentanyl wasn't bad enough, carfentanil has been around since 1974. But it's now entering the world of drug abuse. I mean, go figure. This drug is even 100 times more powerful than fentanyl. It's used in darts as a large animal tranquilizer, which ought to tell you something. And it's used to bring down large animals. But now, kids out there, people out there who use drugs, who use heroin, who use morphine, who use meth, who use fentanyl, are now finding carfentanil, and they're deciding, well, this is cool. So we're going to see an uptick in deaths from this drug. It's an analog of fentanyl, which means it's made from fentanyl. But that means it's also a synthetic drug, which means it doesn't have to be grown. It can be manufactured almost anywhere. Much of it's manufactured south of the border and brought across. But fentanyl is the big bad guy right now. So let's talk about a very, very famous case that is very informative and will probably spark a lot of ideas for crime writers. And it's the famous Kristen Rossum American Beauty case. Again, I have links to that. You might remember the movie American Beauty, where at the end of the day, the rose petals were spread around the bed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a really quirky movie. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's I think it's Annette Bening and Kevin Spacey and some other great actors in it. And it's a bizarre movie, but it's a little slice of noir life, as it were. Well, Kristen Rossum was a very interesting young lady. She came from privilege. She was born and raised she grew up in Claremont, California, where her father was a professor at Claremont McKenna College, and her mother worked over at Azusa Pacific University. So she came from college professors. She was well educated. Uh, but the family then, because of the father's job, moved to Virginia, and Kristen got involved in a school in Richmond, and there she got into beer and cigarettes like a lot of kids do, and then graduated on up to marijuana, and then she began using methamphetamine. Um, this was about 1991, 92. In 1994, she moved back to California and went to University of Redlands, and then later San Diego State University. But her meth habit dogged her. She was a very pretty girl, and that's why the American Beauty thing is. She was very smart. She graduated with honors, and she got a job as a toxicologist at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, which is important in this story. She met and married a guy named Greg DeVillers, and DeVillers was a nice guy from everybody's thoughts on him and everything I've read on him, and so they got married. Um, so Rossum um, was working as a toxicologist in the medical examiner's office, but unfortunately, she started an affair with her boss, a Dr. Michael Robertson, who was Australian, which is also germane to the story. Uh, they apparently attended a conference, and it was where they talked about how difficult it was to determine fentanyl in blood and urine and wherever for toxicological examination. So they talked about how difficult it was, and apparently Kristen took that to heart. Now, I think she was also like stealing meth that came into the office for testing. She'd siphon off a little bit for her own personal use, and she also had access to fentanyl that was coming in. Um, and I mentioned that fentanyl goes through the skin, where there's transdermal patches that people use um, for pain when you don't want to inject it because it's real powerful. Obviously, you don't want to drink it or snort it. So these patches, they stick to the skin. And it slowly releases fentanyl into the system for chronic pain management, particularly in those that are terminally ill. And it's called Duragesic, and there's other preparations out there. Okay, so apparently Kristen decided that she wanted to get rid of her husband because he put the foot down and said, you got to stop your affair, which he had learned about, and you got to clean up and get off meth, neither of which apparently she wanted to do. Now, probably Michael Robertson was involved in this at some level, but I don't think it's ever been hammered out exactly what level his involvement was, but he had to at least have known, people would think. To make a long story short, she called the police and said he had overdosed and was dead in the bed. But when the police arrived, he was laying there with rose petals scattered all over the bed, everywhere, and had overdosed on fentanyl. Well, the supposition was that she'd put patches on him because he wasn't feeling well, and she'd probably been poisoning him with a little fentanyl along the way. And put so many on that he just quit breathing and died. She left for a while, came back for lunch, and there he was dead. She scattered the roses all around and to make it look like a suicide. Now, the police were immediately suspicious because they didn't think a guy would scatter roses all around and then commit suicide. It just didn't seem like a guy thing. So, to make a long story short, they did find the fentanyl. Apparently, it wasn't that hard to discover in the blood, and Rossum was arrested for the murder. Robertson hopped a plane, went back to Australia, and as far as I know, has never returned to the United States because he is still a person of interest in this. And this case is almost 20 years old now, 18 years old, so I think it was 2002. That the arrest took place. So, I mean, it's getting close to a couple of decades. He has never come back as far as I know. What she thought is that, okay, so I poisoned him with this drug that's hard to find. The San Diego coroner's office will take care of this case. I'm in the toxicology department. I can manipulate the data. But the medical examiner there is pretty astute person, and he said, this is too close to home, with this being your husband and you work here. So he farmed it out to another jurisdiction for the toxicological testing, and therein is when the entire scenario unraveled. That's when they found the fentanyl, and that's when they realized that she had to have been involved. And then they started the investigation, and it ended up she was convicted and sentenced to life. That's known as the American Beauty case, and it is a classic case in toxicological history and in criminal justice. Look it up. Like I said, I have some links for it. So at the end of the day, what we've been talking about today is murder using drugs or weapons of mass destruction using certain chemicals. And fentanyl is a new player on the block. You've seen it in the news. You've read about it in the papers. This is what it's all about. It is nasty. It is deadly. It is a extremely powerful drug that only a few granules can kill you. You can't touch it. You can't breathe it. You can't taste it. You can't do anything without having the effect of it. And it's a growing concern. So that wraps up this edition of Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. As I said, there are links in the show notes that'll be posted on both my website and my blog. Go there and look at this stuff, and you can read more about everything we've talked about. I hope this inspires some story ideas in you, or I hope it helps you understand kind of what's going on in the news a little bit better. And until next time, this is DP Lyle signing off.